On June 11, 1962, at precisely 10 p.m., a guard at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary made his final rounds through cell block B. He peered through the bars of cells 138, 140, and 142, nodding with satisfaction at the sight of 3 inmates sleeping peacefully in their bunks. Their heads rested motionless on their pillows, blankets pulled up to their chins. Everything appeared normal. Everything was a lie. What that guard was actually looking at were 3 masterfully crafted dummy heads made from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair stolen from the prison barbershop. The real prisoners, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, were already gone, crawling through a network of ventilation shafts they'd been secretly excavating for nearly 6 months. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the 3 men had vanished into the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, never to be confirmed seen again. To this day, the FBI officially lists the case as unsolved, and former prison officials still shake their heads in disbelief when asked how it was possible. This is the story of the only successful escape from America's most notorious prison, a feat that required genius-level planning, nerves of steel, and a prison-made raft that somehow had to carry 3 men across one of the deadliest stretches of water in North America. Alcatraz wasn't just any prison. Built on a wind-battered rock island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, it was designed to be escape-proof. The facility opened in 1934, specifically to house America's most dangerous and escape-prone criminals, men who had already broken out of other prisons and couldn't be trusted anywhere else. Al Capone did time there. George Machine Gun Kelly spent 17 years inside those walls. The prison was surrounded by water so cold it could kill a man in 20 minutes, with currents so vicious that even Olympic swimmers refused to attempt the crossing. Guards liked to tell new inmates that there had been 14 previous escape attempts from Alcatraz involving 36 men. Most were shot or captured. 5 were never found and presumed drowned. The message was clear. You could try to leave, but you'd die in the attempt. The prison population heard this warning, and most accepted their fate. But Frank Morris wasn't most prisoners. Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, transferred from the federal penitentiary in Atlanta after yet another escape attempt. At 34 years old, he'd spent most of his life behind bars, starting with his first arrest at age 13. But unlike many career criminals who relied on violence or luck, Morris had something far more dangerous, an IQ of 133, putting him in the top 2% of the population. Prison psychologists noted his superior intelligence and exceptional ability to plan. He was charming, patient, and could see patterns others missed. Within months of arriving at Alcatraz, Morris had already identified the prison's fatal flaw. The concrete around the ventilation grates in the cell walls was old, crumbling from decades of salt air corrosion. The prison was literally falling apart from the inside, and nobody had noticed. Morris began testing the concrete around his cell's ventilation grate with a metal spoon stolen from the cafeteria. The material crumbled like chalk. He shared his discovery with the Anglin brothers in the adjacent cells, John in 140 and Clarence in 138. The Anglin brothers, bank robbers from rural Florida, had their own history of impossible escapes. They'd once broken out of a previous prison by hiding in a bread truck. They understood risk and reward. The 3 men looked at that crumbling concrete and saw something nobody else could see: a doorway to freedom. What happened next was a masterclass in criminal ingenuity. The men needed tools, so they improvised with whatever they could steal or scavenge. They fashioned crude chisels from sharpened spoon handles and a drill bit smuggled from the prison workshop. To muffle the sound of their excavation, they waited for music hour each evening when inmates were allowed to play accordions and guitars. While other prisoners practiced songs, Morris and the Anglins scraped away at the concrete behind their ventilation grates, handful by handful, night after night. They hid the debris in their pockets and scattered it in the prison yard during recreation periods. The work was agonizingly slow. Each cell's ventilation grate was only about 6 inches by 9 inches, barely large enough for a human head. They'd need to widen the opening to at least 12 inches to squeeze through. That meant removing thousands of tiny concrete fragments over months of painstaking labor, all while maintaining perfect discipline during daily inspections. A single slip, a piece of concrete left visible, a tool discovered during a shakedown, unusual fatigue noticed by a guard, would end everything. But the 3 men never slipped. They were performing a high-wire act in front of an audience that didn't know it was watching. The ventilation shafts behind the cells led to an unmanned utility corridor that ran the length of the cell block, a dark, narrow passage filled with pipes and electrical conduits that prison guards almost never entered. Morris discovered this corridor could take them all the way to the roof, but reaching the roof was only the beginning. They still needed to get off the island, which meant crossing the bay. That required a raft, and building a raft inside a maximum security prison without anyone noticing was a problem that seemed truly impossible. The solution came from an unlikely source: the prison raincoats. Alcatraz issued each inmate a rubberized raincoat for outdoor work details. Morris realized that if they could acquire enough raincoats and seal them together properly, they could create a waterproof raft. But how do you steal 50 raincoats without anyone noticing? You don't steal them, you hide them in plain sight. The men enlisted a fourth conspirator, Alan West, whose cell was also in B Block. Together they began a subtle campaign of misdirection. They'd accidentally leave raincoats in common areas, then retrieve them later. They'd volunteer for cleanup duties that gave them access to storage rooms. They sweet-talked other inmates into lending their raincoats for a few days. Slowly, carefully, they accumulated the materials they needed. They smuggled the raincoats back to their cells, then up through the ventilation shafts into the utility corridor, where they began the painstaking work of gluing them together using stolen contact cement from the prison workshop. But they needed more than a raft. They needed life preservers to keep them afloat in the freezing water, and they needed paddles. The life preservers they fashioned from more raincoats, inflated and sealed. For paddles, they stole wood from the workshop and shaped it during the rare moments when supervisors weren't watching. Everything had to be stored in the utility corridor, which became their secret workshop, a hidden construction site existing in the shadows above the prison proper. And they still needed to solve the problem of the nightly bed checks. Guards walked the cell block multiple times each night, shining flashlights into cells to verify prisoners were asleep. If even one bed appeared empty, alarms would sound immediately. This is where Morris's genius truly showed. He'd observed the guards' routines and realized they never actually verified that sleeping prisoners were real. They just looked for the shape of a human body under blankets. The dummy heads became the most crucial element of the entire plan. Using stolen barber clippings glued with stolen soap and toilet paper, Morris and the Anglins created false heads that looked remarkably realistic in the dim corridor lighting. They even painted on facial features using flesh-toned paint stolen from the prison art supplies. Each head had real human hair carefully positioned to match its owner's hairstyle. The mannequins were so convincing that they'd later be displayed in the prison museum as examples of criminal artistry. By late May 1962, everything was ready. The ventilation shafts had been excavated wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The raft and life preservers were constructed and hidden in the utility corridor. The dummy heads were perfected. Morris had studied tide tables memorized from a National Geographic magazine in the prison library. He knew that June 11th would offer optimal tidal conditions for reaching the San Francisco mainland. The plan was set for that night. But there was one final obstacle neither Morris nor the Anglin brothers had fully calculated: the human element. Alan West, the fourth conspirator who'd helped plan the escape and gather materials, made a critical error on the night of June 11th. While Morris and the Anglins had been carefully widening their ventilation shaft openings over many months, West had been less diligent. When the time came to execute the escape, he discovered his opening wasn't quite large enough to squeeze through. He spent desperate hours trying to enlarge it while the others waited in the utility corridor, but eventually, Morris made the hardest decision of his life. They couldn't wait any longer. The tides wouldn't cooperate if they delayed, and staying meant risking discovery. Morris, John, and Clarence left West behind and continued alone up to the roof. The climb through the utility corridor took them past rusted pipes and exposed wiring, through decades of accumulated dust and cobwebs. They emerged onto the prison roof sometime after 10 p.m., into the cold night air and the distant glow of San Francisco's city lights across the water. From there, they shimmied down a kitchen vent pipe on the exterior wall, dropped to the ground, and made their way to the northeast shoreline of the island. Somewhere in the darkness, hidden among the rocks, they inflated their homemade raft and life preservers. Then, as fog rolled in across the bay, 3 prisoners pushed off from Alcatraz Island and paddled into the black water. No guards saw them go. No alarm sounded. For those first few hours, the escape was absolutely perfect. Back in the cell block, the dummy heads fooled every guard who made the rounds that night. The deception held until the morning count at 7 a.m., when a guard noticed something odd about the head on Frank Morris's pillow. He reached through the bars and touched it, and the dummy head rolled off onto the floor. Within seconds, whistles were blowing throughout the prison. Within minutes, a full head count revealed 3 men missing. Within an hour, the FBI, Coast Guard, and local police launched the largest manhunt in San Francisco history. What authorities found in the utility corridor stunned them: a complete workshop with tools, materials, and a detailed plan that showed months of preparation. They found the ventilation shaft openings, perfectly concealed behind false grates that could be removed and replaced. They found Alan West still trapped in his cell, and over the next several hours, he told them everything. He described the raft, the life preservers, the escape route, and the timing. Coast Guard vessels immediately began searching the bay, looking for any sign of the fugitives. They found some small pieces of evidence over the next few days: a paddle floating near Angel Island, a life preserver washed up on shore, a wallet wrapped in plastic containing photographs and contacts belonging to the Anglins. But they never found bodies, they never found the raft, and they never found Frank Morris or John and Clarence Anglin. The official FBI position was that the men had drowned, that the raft had failed, or they'd been overcome by hypothermia in the 50-degree water. The case was closed in 1979, with all 3 men presumed dead. But questions lingered that the FBI couldn't answer. Why was there no physical evidence of drowning? Bodies that go into San Francisco Bay almost always wash up somewhere within days. The currents carry them to predictable locations. The bay was searched extensively, and 3 bodies never appeared. Why were the personal photographs removed from the wallet before it was found? If the men drowned, who took out the photos? Why did the paddle show up near Angel Island, more than a mile from Alcatraz, and in the opposite direction of the tidal flow that night? And most mysteriously, why did credible sightings of the Anglin brothers continue for years after the escape? Family members reported receiving Christmas cards and messages. A family friend claimed to have met them in Brazil in the 1970s. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter allegedly written by John Anglin, claiming he was 83 years old and dying of cancer, and offering to turn himself in for medical treatment in exchange for just 1 year in prison. The letter was never authenticated, but handwriting analysis suggested it could be genuine. Former Alcatraz inmates who knew Morris have said privately that if anyone could have made it, it was him, that his intelligence and planning ability were unlike anything they'd seen in any other prisoner. The FBI maintains its official position. The escape was technically successful in that the men got off the island, but they died in the bay. Yet there's an interesting caveat in their statements. In 1993, a U.S. Marshal investigating the case concluded that while the raft might not have been seaworthy enough to reach the mainland, it could have carried them to a point where they intercepted a prepositioned boat with outside help. That theory has never been proven, but it's never been disproven either. What's undeniable is that 3 men pulled off an escape that 36 others had attempted and failed. They did it with improvised tools, stolen materials, and a level of patience that most people can't maintain for 36 days, let alone 6 months. They outsmarted a prison system designed specifically to be inescapable. They anticipated every guard routine, every inspection procedure, every potential failure point. They created a deception so perfect that it fooled trained security officers who were literally staring at fake heads through bars. The dummy heads are now among the most popular exhibits at the Alcatraz Museum, where tourists line up to photograph them. The cells where Morris and the Anglins lived remain unchanged, with the ventilation shafts still visible. Prison officials give tours and explain how impossible the escape should have been, while simultaneously admitting that somehow 3 men did it anyway. Alcatraz closed as a federal prison in 1963, just 1 year after the escape. The official reason was operational costs and maintenance issues. The salt air was destroying the facility faster than repairs could keep up. But former prison officials have admitted privately that the Morris escape was a psychological blow the prison never recovered from. If inmates could do the impossible once, they might try again, and the prison's reputation as escape-proof had been shattered forever. Today, security experts and criminologists still study the Morris escape as a perfect example of what human intelligence and determination can accomplish against overwhelming odds. The plan is taught in criminal justice courses as a case study in both criminal ingenuity and institutional vulnerability. The FBI keeps the case technically open, though no active investigation has occurred in decades. Every year, amateur detectives and true crime enthusiasts propose new theories about what happened to Morris and the Anglins after they vanished into the fog. Some believe they're buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the bay. Others are convinced they made it to South America and lived out their lives in anonymity. A few even suggest they've been hiding in plain sight all along, perhaps in rural America under assumed identities. The truth is, we'll probably never know. That's what makes this escape so fascinating. It's a story with no ending, a mystery that refuses to be solved. Frank Morris would be 98 years old today if he's still alive. The Anglin brothers would be 94 and 93. If they survived, they've kept the greatest secret of their lives for over 60 years. 3 men walked into the darkness with nothing but a homemade raft and a desperate plan, and the world never saw them again. No bodies, no confessions, no proof of death, and no proof of life. Just an empty cell, a dummy head made of soap and hair, and a hole in the wall that led to impossible freedom. The FBI calls it the most brilliant prison escape in American history. They also call it impossible. Somehow it's both.